Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 4. Now Chapter 4 has two big parts, so we're going to get started with the Italian Resurrection and then we'll talk about the Taiping Rebellion. Let's get started. So to understand the Italian Resurrection, I think it's important to understand the locations of everything in Italy. So Italy at the time, much like Germany, was a collective group of different lands. And those lands were different principalities or states. Some of them had their own kings, and a lot of them were governed by Austria. So to begin, number 1 on this map is the Kingdom of Piedmont in the north. And number 2 is the Kingdom of Sardinia. The two became joined, and so they were collectively known as Piedmont, Sardinia. Number 3 is where the papal states are, specifically Rome. Now, papal is just another word meaning pope, and so it is home of the Pope. Number 4 is the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, the bigger section being Naples. And then 5 is Lombardy, which we've talked about before as a big Austrian-controlled area. And 6 ends up being the lands given to France, which we'll talk about in a bit. That is the lands of Savoy and Nice. And 7 is Venetia, where Venice is located in the north. Now, all these locations will be mentioned, so I just wanted to start by giving you an idea of where they were. Let's get started with the different things happening in Italy. So because Italy was not its own country, and because Italy was being controlled majority by the Austrian government, there was a lot of resentment. There was people who wanted Italy to join together and be its own country. They didn't want to be controlled by other people that weren't Italian anymore. But even though they really wanted that, many Italians didn't know what kind of kingdom or what kind of government they wanted Italy to be. Did they want it to be a republic where people voted? Did they want it to be one big country controlled by the Pope? Did they want it to be a kingdom with a king, maybe the king of Piedmont, Sardinia? They weren't sure. But in 1831, a very big secret society group that was being formed at the time to discuss such things was called the Young Italians, and it was led by a man named Mazzini. Now, Mazzini had seen other secret societies who were discussing similar things, how to get away from Austria and such. He had seen them get destroyed by the Austrian government brutally, and he thought enough was enough. And so he passionately formed Young Italy, and so many members started joining this group that the nearby kings and the Austrian government started to get very nervous. It became a crime to be caught being a member of Young Italy. And soon Mazzini got his second in command, his right-hand man, Garibaldi. And Garibaldi became his head of military. And so the two together and the big group of people that had joined Young Italy, passionate young people, they decided to have a revolt against Austria. It was time to do stuff, to take action. And in 1848, they led their first attempt at a revolt against Austria. They were even able to capture Rome, and that scared the Pope. The Pope had to flee Rome, and when he went into hiding in neighboring kingdoms, he sent letters to all Catholic countries in Europe and said, please, send help, put down these rebels, Young Italy. And France was the first one to answer the call. So France came to the rescue of the Austrians and the other local kings, and they helped put down the revolt very successfully. This sent Mazzini fleeing to London and Garibaldi fleeing to the US. But that wasn't the end of Young Italy. 10 years later, still people wanted change. They were still tired of Austria being in charge. They wanted to be their own nation. But the idea of a Republic of Italy with voting was scrapped. They're like, nah, we're not going to do that. They decided to really stick to the idea of becoming a kingdom under the leadership of King Victor Emmanuel II, who was the king of Piedmont, Sardinia. And King Victor Emmanuel II, he knew that if they were going to be successful this time, they needed the help of France. So he wrote a letter to the King of France at the time, King Louis Philippe. This is after the time of Napoleon. And he said, listen, if you come and help us this time on our side, I will give you some of the land when we win. And France thought this was a great idea and said, deal. So at first it was the Italians and the French, but they were losing against the Austrians. And so France, after losing enough people and spending enough money on this war, said, sorry, I'm out. And so France left, but they still took the land that was offered to them originally in the deal. So the new plan that King Emmanuel II had to think of was he sent Garibaldi down south to Naples. And in Naples, he was going to have him gather up the angry and upset poor workers and farmers and have them join to make an army and keep going north doing the same thing and trying and conquering different areas from the south up. And this proved to be very successful. Garibaldi was able to win in Naples, and he was able to march all the way to Rome in the thousands of people following him. And he was able to take over Rome. At this point, they continued to move north, taking over more and more land. And as they did, we had King Victor Emmanuel come down to the south and to Rome and was announced King of Italy. Now, Italy would still have one or two more kingdoms that had yet to join the collective of Italy, but those would be joining in the future. That is it for this part of the chapter. We're going to now jump into the Taiping Rebellion. Now, the Taiping Rebellion happened in China, and it happened between the two Opium Wars. That's important to know. And it was a war between the rich and the poor. The things that had led to this war was the Qing dynasty. Their government was very corrupt. We learned about this in the Opium Wars. And they had a big movement also in China at that time because of overpopulation. They had a big movement of people out of the cities and into the farming lands in the north and the west. And the governments and people in the north and the west were not ready for this big influx of people moving there. And they started to treat these newcomers a little unfairly and just not nicely. So there was issues happening there. And as we know, opium had spread and it was costing China a lot of money because even though England was selling all of this opium to the Chinese and they were addicted, so they were paying as much as they could to get it, the British were not buying a lot of Chinese stuff in return. So it wasn't really equal trade. And in that way, China was getting poorer and poorer. So at this time, there was a man who was in the South, and he had collapsed one day during his studies. And when he was asleep in his fainting spell, he dreamt of this vision of some person like God coming down and somebody like Jesus fighting with him. And when he woke up, he knew that God had sent him a message to gather people and put down the evil king government. So by 1850, he was able to convince many thousands of members to join him in his cause and to believe in him. And they decided to call themselves God worshippers. And part of the God worshipper rules was that there was no alcohol to be drank, no opium to be smoked, and they would put all of their collective goods and money into a treasury that could be used. And Hong decided to name himself Heavenly King. And their group was going to be working towards a heavenly kingdom of peace, which in Chinese is known as Taiping. So that was how it got started. As I told you, he was able to collect over 20,000 members to join his cause. And with that many members, they were ready to start taking action. So they fought landowners in the area, and they were able to capture the city of Yonnang, and this became their military headquarters. After capturing this city, they started to march toward Nanjing. Now, to really show themselves as separate from the Qing dynasty, they started to grow their hair long and not tie it back with ponytails. People that watched them come through called them the long-haired rebels. And as they were marching towards Nanjing, they were raiding homes and government buildings, homes of the rich. And they were giving belongings that they found in the homes of the rich to poor people as they passed. And they were burning tax documents in government buildings as they also were going through. Now, these group of rebels were not just rebels without a plan. They had a vision for China. They had a vision of China where men and women were equal, where all land was split evenly and each family grew their own food. And whatever food they had left over would go into a collective store that people whose maybe their land wasn't good that season, they could access. This was their big dream for China. And eventually they did reach Nanjing and they were able to capture it successfully and they made it their new capital. But after Nanjing, they thought they were going to be able to capture Beijing. They said, we've won 2 already. God is on our side. We can capture Beijing where the emperor lived. But unfortunately, some things had shifted in the power play here. They were not able to successfully capture Beijing because the Qing soldiers were able to successfully block it, but the Qing dynasty was not able to take over Nanjing. The fighting was going back and forth, back and forth. And then we saw a partnership start to happen, a partnership between the British and the King Emperor. The King Emperor had told the British, hey, I will open more ports for you if you help me put down this rebellion. And they said, done. So the British joined in, and in 1860, the Taiping group tried to take over Shanghai, but they were stopped by the British, and the British pushed them all the way back to Nanjing, and they were able to capture Nanjing back for the government. At this, they knew that their cause was doomed, and the heavenly king himself killed himself, and this was the end of the Taiping Rebellion in 1864. That's it for chapter 4. I'll see you next time for Story of the World Highlights. Bye-bye.